The likes of you don't belong here. Why don't you go back to Africa?" An elderly woman openly spewed a racist insult toward a young black man. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. But instead of showing anger or backing down, the young man responded with a powerful statement that left everyone stunned and changed everything. What happened next? Stay tuned for this emotional story and witness the power of courage. Don't forget to subscribe to catch more meaningful stories like this. It was a peaceful afternoon at a grocery store in a small town in Ohio. Gentle sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, creating an airy and inviting atmosphere. The clattering of shopping carts and the quiet hum of conversations among customers filled the space. People were busy with their daily errands, from picking fresh fruit to chatting with acquaintances. A young black man, tall and exuding confidence, walked through the store. He wore a blue jacket and simple jeans, carrying a small bag over his shoulder. Ethan radiated a calm and relaxed demeanor, blending seamlessly into the flow of people in the store. As he texted on his phone, he strolled through the aisles, holding a shopping basket with a few basic items already inside. An elderly woman, around 70 years old, with a neat and modest appearance, was standing nearby. She wore a light beige cardigan, her silver hair neatly tied back in a bun, a picture of poise and refinement. But deep down, Martha harbored deeply ingrained prejudices. She stood near the fruit counter, slowly inspecting apples one by one, her face clouded with a hint of displeasure, as if she were brooding over something. Everything seemed ordinary until Ethan approached the fruit counter, stopping a few steps away from Martha. He paused to select a bag of oranges and continued texting, seemingly unaware of the people around him. But Martha noticed him. Her expression instantly changed, from indifferent to icy. She froze, her grip tightening around the plastic bag in her hand, her eyes fixed on Ethan. The space around them grew eerily quiet. Ethan, oblivious, remained engrossed in his phone. But Martha's demeanor signaled that something unusual and unsettling was about to unfold. Ethan was still focused on his phone screen when Martha, with a stern gaze, finally couldn't hold back any longer. She adjusted her cardigan as if preparing to say something important. In a clear and decisive voice, she broke the silence. "People like you don't belong here. Why don't you go back to Africa?" Her words rang out like a piercing bell in the warm, welcoming atmosphere of the store. The sound of shopping carts stopped, and the quiet hum of conversations came to an abrupt halt. The space was suddenly filled with an oppressive silence. Those nearby froze in place, their eyes darting between Martha and Ethan before quickly looking down at the floor, avoiding direct contact with anyone. Martha had lived her entire life in this small town, where everyone knew one another. She prided herself on being part of the tradition of the community, where change was often viewed as a threat. Memories of the old days when the town had few people of color were deeply ingrained in her mind. Her words stemmed not only from unconscious bias but also from a personal story. She had lost her husband in a traffic accident, mistakenly blaming a black man for it. Since then, bitterness had grown in her heart, leading her to associate her pain with racial prejudice. To her, Ethan symbolized what she felt didn't belong, even though, in reality, she knew nothing about him. Yet her words carried not just anger, but also a mix of defensiveness and confusion. She didn't realize that she too was trapped in her pain and outdated thinking. Ethan flinched and looked up at the sound of her offensive remark. His eyes widened, a mix of shock and disbelief crossing his face. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, not out of anger but out of profound disappointment. For a moment, the world seemed to stop spinning. He didn't respond right away. His hand held his phone tightly, his fingers frozen mid-swipe on the open screen. He blinked a few times, as though trying to confirm he had heard her correctly. Ethan took a deep breath, his expression shifting from surprise to calmness. He could feel the attention of everyone around him. Without even looking, he knew there were those waiting to see his reaction, while others deliberately turned away, pretending not to have heard. Instead of reacting immediately, Ethan chose silence. His eyes moved away from Martha, staring into the distance as if searching for the most reasonable response. His silence was not out of helplessness, but a deliberate pause to consider every word and every action, ensuring he not only protected himself, but also changed the dynamic of the situation. The moments following Martha's words felt endless. A young mother quickly pushed her cart away from the area, trying to shield her child from hearing anything further. An elderly couple near the bakery counter exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. A young store clerk arranging bananas nearby hesitated. She froze mid-motion, her eyes flicking quickly from Ethan to Martha. She seemed half inclined to intervene, but held back, worried that doing so might escalate the situation. The atmosphere in the store was now so heavy, it was suffocating. Everyone felt the weight of Martha's offensive words, but no one dared to break the silence spreading through the air. Ethan, after a few seconds of quiet, finally raised his eyes to meet Martha's. His gaze carried no anger, only a mixture of understanding and sadness. He recognized that her words were not merely a personal insult, but a sign of a deeper wound, one she might not even be aware of. "Ma'am?" Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and calm. "Do you truly understand what you just said?" His gentle words cut through the silence like a ray of light piercing the darkness, signaling that this was only the beginning of a conversation that would change everything. Ethan stood there, his gaze calm but challenging, as if waiting for an acknowledgement, or at least a hint of remorse from Martha. Instead, her face grew more rigid, and her eyes burned with discontent. "Ma'am?" Ethan repeated his question, his voice gentle yet firm. Martha, rather than backing down, tightened her grip on the bag of apples in her hand. Her face suddenly flushed red, and the heavy atmosphere seemed to fan the flames inside her. The silence of the surrounding crowd didn't deter her. It only made her feel more compelled to defend her point of view. Martha wasn't deliberately malicious, but her life had been a series of bitter and painful experiences deeply etched into her subconscious. Years ago, her husband Frank, a veteran, had died in a car accident. The driver of the car was a young black man. Although the accident had been caused by poor weather conditions, Martha had always harbored the belief that the blame lay with people like them. The pain of losing her life partner, combined with prejudices instilled during her youth, gradually shaped her rigid perspective, that those who were different from her were a threat. The small town she lived in had once been her haven, but in recent years cultural changes and the arrival of new residents had left her feeling alienated in her community. She didn't realize that her unresolved pain had turned her into a bitter person, hurting not just others, but also herself. Martha looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and anger. "People like you," she said, her voice ringing clearly in the tense air, "are ruining this country. This is our place, not yours." Her words echoed through the store, like a sharp blade slicing through the already strained atmosphere. Her shoulders trembled slightly, but she maintained her steady gaze on Ethan as if daring anyone to challenge her. The air grew suffocatingly quiet. A few nearby customers stepped back, trying to distance themselves from the sensitive situation. A young store clerk stood frozen nearby, still holding a bunch of bananas, seemingly paralyzed mid-motion. Ethan remained still, unmoving. He let her words linger in the air, allowing their bitterness to dissipate on their own, and ensuring that everyone around had heard each syllable. Deep down, Martha felt a slight wavering. She couldn't deny that Ethan's voice carried confidence without a hint of anger. This unsettled her more than anything else. She was used to those she attacked responding with either rage or retreat, but Ethan did neither. His calmness made her feel cornered. But rather than pause and reflect, she chose to push further. "I don't understand why people like you keep coming here, taking all the jobs and ruining everything." The crowd around them began to murmur. Some appeared shocked by Martha's words, while others remained still, avoiding Ethan's gaze. But no one dared speak up, allowing the situation to grow even tenser. Ethan didn't rush to respond. He looked at Martha, his eyes carrying no anger but instead a hint of sadness, as though he understood that her words stemmed from something deeper than mere prejudice. At that moment, Ethan felt the weight of every gaze fixed on him. He blinked, took a deep breath, and silently asked himself, "Should I say something? Will they listen, or will I only make things worse?" The weight of her hateful words felt like a stone pressing down on his shoulders, but memories of his parents gave him strength. He recalled his mother's words. "Ethan, the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. Speak with kindness, and the truth will do the rest." Ethan gripped the strap of his shopping basket lightly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "This isn't just about me," he thought. "This is about people like me and those who've never had the chance to stand up." With that thought, the pressure in his chest eased, replaced by an unusual sense of calm. "Ma'am," he finally spoke, his voice steady and calm, "do you truly believe that I, my family, and people like me don't have a right to be here?" Ethan's words echoed through the quiet space, not just as a question for Martha, but for everyone standing nearby. The crowd fell silent, their attention focused entirely on the two of them. Martha faltered slightly, unprepared for Ethan to confront her in such a manner, but her hesitation lasted only a moment. She quickly regained her determination, her face reddening further with anger. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "People like you don't know how to preserve anything. You just take and destroy." Her words were like a poisoned arrow aimed directly at Ethan. But instead of reacting immediately, Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, as though preparing himself for something much greater. Ethan stood firm, maintaining a calm demeanor in his gaze. But before he could say anything further, another voice rang out from across the produce counter, slicing through the tense atmosphere like a sharp blade. "She's right." A middle-aged man stepped forward, his stocky frame and resolute expression carrying an air of authority. It was Jack, an old friend of Martha's. Crossing his arms over his chest, he cast a cold look at Ethan, emphasizing his agreement with Martha's words. "We need to protect our country," he said, his tone firm and unwavering. Jack's statement ignited the simmering tension among the crowd. A few people nearby nodded slightly, their eyes betraying agreement, though no one else spoke. Others turned away, trying to ignore the situation, unwilling to get involved in the sensitive confrontation. A young mother, standing near the bread section, quietly pulled her child further away, her expression filled with worry. An elderly couple by the frozen foods exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't dare voice any objection to Jack or Martha. The store's atmosphere, already heavy, now felt completely divided. On one side were those who agreed with Martha and Jack, while on the other were those who disagreed but stayed silent out of fear of being drawn into the conflict. Ethan now found himself not only facing Martha, but also the division and quiet judgment of the crowd. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on his shoulders. He knew that one wrong word or a moment of unrestrained anger could send the situation spiraling out of control. Jack continued, now directing his words straight at Ethan, his voice cold and confrontational. "People like you don't understand the value of this country. You just come here to take, but you never contribute anything." His words were like a sharp dagger, aimed not only at Ethan but at his family and the community he represented. Ethan tightened his grip on the strap of his shopping basket. A flicker of emotion flashed in his eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. Rather than retaliating, Ethan took a deep breath, letting his gaze sweep over the silent crowd. He could feel everyone's attention on him, some empathetic, others critical. He spoke, his voice low but clear. "Mr. Jack, I'm not here to take anything. I'm here as an American, living in the country that my family helped build for generations." His words caused a brief pause in the air. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances as if questioning whether Ethan's statement might be true. Ethan continued, now addressing both Martha and Jack. "You say that we don't contribute? Let me tell you about my family. My grandfather fought in World War II to defend this country, but when he came back, he wasn't treated like a hero. Still, he stood tall, worked hard, and provided for his family because he believed this country could be better. And now, I'm living here, working, paying taxes, contributing to my community, just like anyone else." Ethan's words left some in the crowd visibly unsettled. An older man near the vegetable section nodded slightly in agreement. A store employee named Mia, who had been standing silently in the background, stepped forward cautiously, her expression showing quiet support, though she seemed hesitant to speak and risk worsening the situation. Jack, however, wasn't ready to back down. He shook his head, letting out a dismissive laugh before responding. "Nice stories, but they don't change the facts. Look at you. You're still an outsider here." Those words landed like a final blow against Ethan. The crowd remained silent, all eyes now fixed on him, waiting to see how he would respond to Jack's relentless provocation. At that moment, an older man near the bread counter, George, a longtime resident of the town, unexpectedly spoke up. "Jack, you've gone too far," George said, his voice slow but authoritative. "I've lived here my whole life and seen many changes, but without people like Ethan and his family, this country wouldn't have what we have today. You have a right to your opinion, but your words have crossed the line." George's statement caused Jack to falter. He glanced around, realizing that many in the crowd were now nodding in agreement with George. A young woman holding a child added, "That's right. Ethan has handled this with a kindness that we should all learn from. We can't keep living with these outdated prejudices." Jack sighed and stepped back, his confidence visibly shaken. Avoiding the crowd's gaze, he finally fell silent. Realizing he no longer had the support he once thought he did, Jack lowered his head and retreated from the confrontation without saying another word. The tension in the store remained taut as a bowstring after Jack's provocation. The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on Ethan as if waiting to see what he would do next. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over Martha, Jack, and the people around him. After a brief hesitation, he stepped forward. His movement was unhurried but deliberate. He set his shopping basket down on the floor, his eyes still calm, but his voice rang out clearly and firmly, breaking the suffocating silence. "Let's have this conversation properly," he began, his words carrying the weight of confidence and understanding. "Do you know what my family has done to build this country?" Martha hesitated for a moment. She hadn't expected Ethan to face her like this, calm, unyielding, and devoid of anger. Instead of reacting aggressively as she had anticipated, Ethan used a tone that was gentle yet powerful, leaving her momentarily unsettled. She tightened her grip on the bag of apples in her hand, her eyes darting away for a moment before quickly regaining her stern expression. But even so, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, enough for the crowd to notice. The people around them began to pay closer attention. The quiet divide within the crowd temporarily subsided, replaced by curiosity. An older man near the vegetable section stepped closer, as though he wanted to hear Ethan more clearly. Mia, the store clerk, finally broke her silence. She gently set down the bunch of bananas she had been holding and stood upright, her eyes focused on Ethan, ready to speak up if necessary. Even Jack, who had just supported Martha, seemed taken aback by Ethan's confidence. He frowned, but didn't interrupt, waiting to see if Ethan could offer an argument to counter his stance. Jack's voice rose, trying to overpower the stillness in the store. "You talk a good game," he emphasized, his sharp gaze fixed on Ethan. "But it's all just words. I hear people like you talk about fairness, but you destroy what's best about this country. No matter what you say, you and people like you don't belong here." Jack's words flared up like a fire in the already tense atmosphere. A few in the crowd shook their heads, their disapproval evident, while others remained silent, their eyes avoiding Ethan out of fear or discomfort. Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, his eyes calm but resolute. "Mr. Jack," he said, his voice low but firm, "I'm not here to destroy or take anything away. I'm here, like all of you, to contribute and build a better community." Ethan stood tall, his shoulders bearing the weight, not just of his dignity but of his entire community. He began to speak, his tone measured yet full of conviction. "My family has lived in this country for generations. My great-grandfather was a farmer in Mississippi, working from dawn to dusk in fields he would never own, just so his children might have a better life. And my grandfather—" Ethan paused, his gaze locking onto Martha. "My grandfather fought in World War II. He fought for this country, defending the values we all hold dear. But when he came back, he wasn't welcomed as a hero. Instead, he was treated as though he didn't deserve to be here." Ethan's words deepened the silence in the room. A few in the crowd began to shake their heads, expressing quiet disagreement with the injustice Ethan described. And our older woman near the bread counter gently placed a hand over her chest, her eyes filled with empathy. Martha, despite trying to maintain her stern expression, couldn't hide her growing unease. She looked down at the bag of apples in her hand, avoiding Ethan's gaze. But she didn't speak, nor did she immediately refute his words. Ethan bent down to pick up his shopping basket but didn't leave. Instead, he turned back to face both Martha and Jack. "I'm not here to argue, and I don't want to make things worse. But if someone tells me I don't belong in this country, I will stand up and speak the truth. My family has sweat, bled, and sacrificed to build this nation, just like yours. I have every right to stand here, just like anyone else." Ethan's words struck like lightning in the silence that followed. The crowd no longer appeared as divided as before. Those who had sided with Martha now seemed uncertain, while others began to nod in agreement with Ethan. Martha remained where she stood, but the rigidity in her expression started to fade. Ethan's words were not just a rebuttal, they were a poignant reminder of history and sacrifice, something she could not easily ignore. The store remained silent after Ethan's powerful declaration. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on those around him, especially Martha and Jack. The air felt frozen in time, every eye trained on him, waiting for what might come next. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes slowly scanning the crowd. When he spoke, his words were no longer directed solely at Martha, but to everyone within earshot. "My grandfather fought in World War II," Ethan began, his voice deliberate, every word weighted with emotion. "He carried a gun to defend freedom, not just for himself, but for all of us, regardless of skin color, religion, or origin." He paused, his eyes resting on Martha. But when he came back, he wasn't welcomed as a hero. Instead, he was denied service in restaurants and barred from entering the very cafes he had fought to protect. He was looked down upon, simply because of the color of his skin. Ethan's words flowed through the silent atmosphere like an undercurrent, steady and unyielding. An elderly woman near the bread counter quietly dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Mia, the store clerk, stood motionless, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ethan continued, his tone now tinged with both pride and bitterness. "But my grandfather didn't give up. He worked hard every single day, rebuilding a life for his family because he believed this country could be better. He believed in America's promise, even though that promise had never been fully kept for him." Ethan's voice softened slightly, his eyes reflecting reverence. "My parents were the same. They didn't fight with guns or swords, but they fought through their everyday work. My mother was a teacher. She spent her life educating children, not just teaching them knowledge, but instilling in them kindness, respect, and hope. My father was a mechanic. He was the kind of man who would stop his car in the middle of the road to help anyone, no matter what they looked like or where they came from." Ethan's gaze rested firmly on Martha, softening slightly, though his voice remained resolute. "They raised me to believe that kindness is the greatest strength we have. They taught me that I'm not just an American. I'm part of history, part of the hope that this country can be better." Ethan's story hung heavily in the air. The crowd, once divided, now seemed united in a shared sense of empathy, reflection, and perhaps a twinge of shame. But Ethan wasn't finished. He looked directly at Martha, his expression filled not with anger but with profound understanding. Then he said something that left everyone, especially Martha, stunned. "Ma'am, my mother used to teach at the high school here, and I'm sure you remember. You once thanked her for helping your granddaughter pass her final exams." The room seemed to stop. Martha's eyes widened in shock and confusion. She stammered slightly, as though struggling to recall. Her face shifted, the rigidity melting into a mix of surprise and disbelief. Ethan continued, his voice now gentler. "My mother taught your granddaughter that nothing is impossible, that with hard work, anyone can succeed. And you know what? I think she was right. But for that to happen, we need a community that isn't divided, a place where everyone has a chance." Martha stood there, clutching the bag of apples in her hand. Her shoulders trembled faintly. She couldn't argue against what Ethan had just said, because deep down, she knew it was the truth. Memories of her gratitude to a dedicated teacher resurfaced, and the realization left her visibly conflicted. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes wandered slightly as if searching for a justification. But instead of justification, there was only the heavy silence that enveloped her. The atmosphere in the store grew heavier than ever after Ethan's heartfelt story, particularly the revelation about his mother helping Martha's granddaughter. A tense silence filled the air, not one of unity, but of palpable anticipation, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Martha remained motionless, her gaze unfocused for a moment, her hand gripping the bag of apples tightly. But before she could respond, a sharp voice rang out from across the counter. "I don't care what your family has done," Jack said, his tone cold and resolute. He stepped forward, fixing his eyes on Ethan as if to shatter the wave of empathy Ethan had just created. "We don't need you here." Jack's words pierced through the already tense atmosphere like a dagger. His gaze was filled with defiance, as if to assert that Ethan's personal story could never shake his prejudices. "What your family has done doesn't change the facts," Jack continued, his voice growing louder. "People like you don't belong here, and no sob story is going to change my mind." Jack's words made the already heavy air in the store even more stifling. A few people in the crowd discreetly took out their phones, beginning to record the incident, sensing that this was no longer just a heated argument, but something larger in the making. In the distance, Mia, the young store clerk, hesitated by the banana stand. She had heard every word and could feel the injustice in Jack's tone, but she was unsure how to intervene. Did she have the right to speak up, or should she stay silent to avoid escalating the situation? Her eyes darted around, searching for support from her co-workers, but none of them stepped forward. An older man near the produce section quietly shook his head, his expression filled with disappointment. A young couple by the bread aisle whispered to each other but didn't dare speak up. The divide in the store became increasingly apparent. Some silently sided with Ethan, while others, though they didn't voice it, seemed to agree with Jack. Ethan stood his ground, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on Jack. There was no anger in his eyes, but the steadiness of his look was like a wall Jack couldn't break through. Martha, still standing beside Jack, took a small step back. Jack's words, though echoing her earlier sentiments, made her feel an unexplainable discomfort. She couldn't shake Ethan's earlier words about his mother, who had once helped her granddaughter in a time of need. Jack's defiance didn't embolden her, it made her feel smaller. She sighed softly, her gaze avoiding Ethan's. Her hand trembled slightly as it clutched the bag of apples, as though seeking something to anchor herself. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, Mia decided to step forward. In a gentle but clear voice, she said, "Excuse me, but maybe we should all calm down. This is a store, and I don't think this is the right place for an argument like this." Mia's words, though soft, acted like a jolt, snapping the crowd out of its daze. A few people turned to look at her, their faces showing agreement, while others, including Jack, regarded her with less favorable expressions. Jack let out a derisive snort and turned to Mia. "Who do you think you are to interfere? This isn't your business." But Mia didn't back down. She stood straight, her eyes meeting Jack's. "As someone who works here, I think I have the right to ask everyone to behave respectfully. We can all speak to each other politely, can't we?" Ethan offered a faint smile, not one of triumph, but of gratitude toward Mia. He stepped forward, his gaze steady on Jack. When he spoke, his voice was calm, yet brimming with strength. "I'm not here to argue with you. I just want to say that I, like everyone else here, have the right to exist and contribute to this community. If you don't want to listen, then I'll let my actions, and the actions of my family, speak for themselves." The atmosphere in the store felt stretched to its breaking point, as though even the slightest sound might shatter it. Ethan remained calm, his gaze gently sweeping over Jack and Martha before turning to the crowd. But before he could say anything further, a sudden voice rang out from the end of the aisle. "That's enough." Everyone turned, their eyes searching for the source of the voice. It was Mr. Henry, an older man with a head of silver hair but a posture still strong and steady. He slowly stepped forward, his expression stern yet warm. Mr. Henry looked directly at Jack, then turned to Martha, his voice firm and commanding. "He has as much right to be here as anyone else. I fought in World War II, and let me tell you this. I fought alongside men like him. And in the trenches, the color of your skin never mattered. The only thing that mattered was whether you could trust the person next to you. Mr. Henry's words caused the crowd to pause. Some lowered their heads, while others exchanged thoughtful glances. Jack, who had been loudly criticizing Ethan moments before, hesitated for a moment, then took a step back, as though weighed down by Henry's steady gaze. Henry continued, his tone softening but remaining clear. We can't choose how we're born, but we can choose how we treat others. And I think Ethan has shown that he deserves every opportunity this country can offer. As the tension in the air began to ease, Mia, the young cashier, unexpectedly spoke up from the checkout counter. Her gaze swept across the room, landing on Ethan and Martha. He handled this with a kindness we could all learn from, she said, her voice not loud but clear enough for everyone to hear. I've watched this whole thing unfold, and I have to say Ethan has a right to be here. Not just a legal right, but the right to be respected as a human being. Mia's words, though simple, carried a sincerity that resonated deeply. An elderly woman near the bread section nodded quietly in agreement, while a young couple exchanged sheepish glances, as though realizing their silence may have contributed to the tension. The words of Mr. Henry and Mia struck a chord with Martha. She remained silent, but the rigidity in her expression began to fade. She looked down at the bag of apples in her hand, her fingers clutching it so tightly that the plastic crinkled. She couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's story about his mother, the woman who had once helped her granddaughter. Martha hesitated, torn between her ingrained beliefs and a truth she couldn't deny. Finally, she sighed softly but said nothing more. A small but noticeable shift began to take place in the crowd. An older man near the produce section spoke up, his tone reflective. Henry's right. We need to treat each other better. Skin color shouldn't matter. A young woman who had been filming the scene lowered her phone, her expression turning pensive. I think he's brave to stand here and face all of us like this, she said quietly, loud enough for a few nearby to hear. Ethan smiled faintly, not a smile of triumph, but one of gratitude. He nodded toward Mr. Henry, his eyes shining with appreciation. Turning to Mia, he responded softly, Thank you. Sometimes kindness is the only thing we need to break down barriers. The store, once tense and divided, now felt calmer, like the stillness after a storm. But the story was far from over. Real change doesn't come in a single moment. It takes time to take root in the hearts and minds of people. Ethan's story, along with the support from Mr. Henry and Mia, had shifted the atmosphere in the store. Yet, for Martha, their words were not just a lesson in fairness, but a powerful blow to the deeply rooted prejudices she had carried for so many years. She stood still, clutching the bag of apples tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Ethan's words echoed in her mind like hammer blows shattering the old beliefs she had built her life around. Memories of her late husband, Frank, suddenly surfaced. Frank had been a veteran, much like Ethan's grandfather. She recalled the stories Frank would tell after dinner, stories of courage, camaraderie, and sacrifice among soldiers, regardless of their skin color or background. Once, she distinctly remembered Frank saying, "The trenches don't care who you are. If you're willing to stand up and protect the person next to you, you've earned respect." Those words had once guided her, but over the years the pain of loss and bitter experiences had made her forget. When Ethan spoke of his grandfather fighting in World War II, just like Frank, she couldn't deny the parallels. Martha hesitated, her trembling hands gripping the bag of apples as if seeking stability. She felt uneasy, not because of Ethan, but because of herself. She began questioning whether the beliefs she had clung to for so long were truly justified. Everything Ethan said made sense, yet her ingrained stubbornness tried to hold her back. Maybe I'm not wrong, she told herself, but the conviction behind those words wasn't as strong as it used to be. The memory of thanking Ethan's mother, who had helped her granddaughter through a difficult time at school, resurfaced. At the time, she had been so grateful, even, saying, "You're an amazing teacher. I don't know what we would have done without you." So why now was she turning her back on the kindness she had once received? Her conflicted emotions were evident on her face. Her shoulders slumped, and she avoided everyone's gaze. She felt as though she were being judged, not just by the crowd, but by her conscience. Martha glanced around, her eyes meeting those of an elderly woman nearby. The woman's expression wasn't one of agreement, but of quiet disappointment. Martha's heart raced, her hands trembling slightly as they gripped the bag of apples. Was I wrong? She wondered, only for another voice in her mind to counter, "No, I was just defending what's right." But the memory of her granddaughter resurfaced. The child's innocent face as she spoke about her favorite teacher, Ethan's mother, was impossible to ignore. Grandma. She said nothing is impossible if you just try. The girl's sweet words echoed in her mind. Martha swallowed hard, but the lump in her throat refused to go away. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Her voice was caught in her throat. Something had shifted within her, but she wasn't yet ready to admit it. Ethan stood quietly, saying nothing more. He didn't push for an apology or demand anything of her. He understood that change took time, and sometimes planting a seed was enough. In that moment, her husband's words echoed once more, stronger than ever. We can't choose how we're born, but we can choose how we treat others. Frank had lived by those words, and now Martha realized she had strayed from that path, but she didn't know how to find her way back. All she knew was that Ethan had made her see things differently. Martha sighed softly, her gaze still averted, but for the first time, the hardness in her expression gave way to something more complex. A flicker of uncertainty, a quiet but undeniable shift. The crowd remained still, waiting for something to happen. Yet no one pressured her, and no one spoke a word. The atmosphere in the store remained suffocating, though the tension had slightly eased. Martha stood still, her gaze lost, as if wrestling with herself. The words of Ethan, Mr. Henry, and Mia echoed in her mind. But her silence didn't shake Ethan's resolve. He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice firm yet unforced. "I'm not standing here to win or lose," Ethan said, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, pausing on each face, especially Martha's. His voice wasn't loud, but every word carried the weight of sincerity and understanding. "I'm standing here to speak the truth," he continued. "We all live in this country, and each of us has a responsibility to make it better. Not by dividing or belittling others, but by learning to respect one another. My family, just like yours, has worked tirelessly to contribute to this community. And I'm here not to take anything for free, but to keep building on those contributions." He paused for a moment, letting his words settle into the charged atmosphere before turning to look directly at Martha. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "I don't expect you to change overnight, but I hope what I've said today will give you something to think about. Sometimes we need to stop and see life through someone else's eyes. Not because we're wrong, but because it helps us understand each other better." After Ethan's words, the store fell into complete silence. There were no more murmurs, no more harsh words, only quiet. A silence not of discomfort, but of reflection. The crowd stood motionless, their eyes shifting from Ethan to Martha and back to Ethan again. A few people nodded slightly, as though agreeing with his message. An elderly woman near the bread counter placed a hand over her chest, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Martha, who had once loudly criticized Ethan, was now utterly silent. Her gaze no longer carried the defiant hardness it once had. Instead, she appeared torn, consumed by a mix of complex emotions: shame, anger at herself, and perhaps a touch of regret. The silence was so profound that the faint sound of each breath could be heard. It felt like the calm after a storm, everything subdued, but with lingering echoes slowly dissipating. Martha said nothing. She had no words to argue with and lacked the courage to admit she was wrong. But in her eyes there was a newfound softness, a quiet acknowledgment of something she couldn't deny. She lowered her head, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes to those around her. It was a signal that she had begun to reflect. Ethan glanced around at the crowd once more, his eyes filled with hope. "I'm not asking anything of you today except one thing. Think. Try to put yourself in someone else's position, even just once. We don't have to agree with each other, but at the very least, we can treat one another with kindness." He picked up his shopping basket, his gaze lingering on Martha one final time before he turned to leave. "Thank you for listening," he said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. As Ethan walked away, no one spoke. The crowd seemed to still be processing everything that had just unfolded. A few people nodded at him quietly as he passed, their gestures small but meaningful. Martha remained where she was, the bag of apples trembling slightly in her hands. For the first time in years, she felt the need to reconsider everything, about Ethan, about what she had believed, and about herself. Ethan walked away, his shopping basket in hand, his demeanor calm though tinged with weariness. His final words seemed to linger in the air, slowing time itself for everyone in the store. Suddenly, from the far end of the aisle, a sound broke the silence, a single clap. Everyone turned to see who it was. It was Mr. Henry, the older man who had supported Ethan earlier. He clapped slowly but resolutely, each clap carrying a message of support and respect. Mia, the young cashier, didn't hesitate. She stepped forward from behind the counter, her hands joining in a steady rhythm. Soon, others in the store began to clap, some hesitantly at first, but then with growing enthusiasm. The applause swelled, filling the store, not just as a show of support for Ethan, but as an acknowledgement of the truth and courage in his message. Across the aisle, Jack stood silently, his lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing more, but his eyes avoided the scene, reflecting discomfort. Finally, he lowered his head and slowly walked out of the store without a word. Martha stood motionless, the bag of apples still clutched in her hands, as if caught between two worlds. Her gaze shifted between shame and deep reflection. The applause around her made her feel smaller than she ever had before. In the end, she said nothing. She quietly turned her shopping cart and walked away in silence. She left the store without looking back, her face betraying that the events of the day would haunt her for a long time. As Ethan approached the checkout counter, a young mother holding her child stepped closer to him. She smiled softly, her expression filled with gratitude. "Mr. Ethan," she said, her voice low but full of emotion, "thank you for standing up for what's right. Not everyone dares to say what needs to be said, especially in a moment like this." Ethan turned to her, offering a sincere smile. "Thank you," he replied. "Sometimes we have no choice but to stand up. I just hope this makes people think." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've done more than make people think," she said. "You've inspired many of us, including me." Her young son tugged at her sleeve, looking up at Ethan with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, is he a superhero?" the boy asked innocently, drawing a soft laugh from both Ethan and his mother. "I'm just a regular person," Ethan replied, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "But sometimes regular people can do important things." The applause faded, and people began to return to their shopping. Yet the atmosphere in the store had changed. A quiet sense of peace prevailed. Not the silence of indifference, but the stillness of reflection and newfound awareness. Ethan finished his purchase and left the store, leaving behind a space that had undergone a small but profound transformation. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long beams of light across the ground. Ethan walked slowly toward his car, not feeling triumphant or victorious, just carrying a small hope that his words might have planted seeds of change in those who had listened. In the distance, in the parking lot, Martha sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her face was pensive, her eyes distant. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, mingling with memories of her late husband and the lessons about fairness she had once held dear. She didn't know if she dared to apologize to Ethan, but one thing was certain. This was a day she would never forget. Back home, Martha couldn't shake the heaviness in her heart. After dinner, she stepped outside, standing quietly under the warm glow of her porch light. The darkness enveloped the small neighborhood, but the lights from other homes sparkled like small beacons, each telling its own story. Her eyes settled on the house across the street, a black family who had moved in a few months ago. Through the soft glow of the street light, she saw them on their porch, laughing and chatting together. The father held a young child in his arms, playfully tickling the little one until they burst into gleeful laughter. The mother smiled, adjusting the child's scarf with a look of pure affection. Martha froze, watching them. For the first time she truly saw them, not as strangers but as a family, filled with love and yearning for happiness, just like hers once had been. A warmth mixed with an ache swelled in her chest. The sound of their laughter no longer felt distant. It resonated, a reminder that every family, regardless of skin color or origin, carried a story worth cherishing. She stood there for a long time, then whispered to herself, "Diversity isn't a threat. Maybe it's a strength." Martha turned back toward her door, closing it behind her. But within her, another door had just begun to open. As the twilight softened over the parking lot, Ethan drove away, leaving the store and the events behind. Yet, what he left behind was not just a fleeting story. It was a spark, beginning to illuminate hidden corners in the hearts of many. That evening, Martha sat alone in her small kitchen. The dinner on the table remained untouched, the plates set but left undisturbed. The dim yellow light cast shadows on her face, highlighting the features of a woman who had lived through much but was now deeply unsettled. Ethan's words replayed in her mind like a refrain she couldn't escape. She thought about the story of Ethan's grandfather, a World War II veteran, and couldn't help but draw parallels to her late husband, Frank. Frank had also spoken of his black comrades, men who had fought bravely beside him. Martha looked down at her hands, the same hands that had once held her granddaughter, taught by Ethan's mother. She remembered the teacher's smile and the dedication to her lessons. And then, for the first time in years, a question surfaced. In her mind, clear and unyielding. Could I have been wrong? This realization didn't come easily. It carried the sting of admitting that the beliefs and prejudices she had held on to for so long might have hurt not just others, but herself as well. In the days that followed, Ethan's story spread across the town. Those who had been present at the store recounted the incident to friends, family, and neighbors. No one could forget the way Ethan remained calm, how he confronted prejudice with courage and kindness. Elsewhere in town, at a small gathering, Ethan's story became the topic of discussion. A middle-aged man spoke up. "We need to change. We can't keep living with this kind of prejudice forever." Such conversations began to emerge more frequently. A few people even organized meetings to discuss kindness and ways to improve the community. Ethan hadn't sought attention, but his actions had sparked a small yet meaningful movement. Even Jack, who had loudly opposed Ethan, was now quieter at community meetings. He no longer defended his earlier views, but neither had he found the courage to admit he was wrong. Ethan's story wasn't an immediate, sweeping victory. It didn't change everyone overnight. But it was a seed of reflection, compassion, and hope. Martha didn't apologize to Ethan right away, but she hoped that one day, when she felt brave enough, she would have the chance to tell him she regretted her words. This story reminds us that change begins with small actions. Sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up, speak the truth with courage and kindness, and light the way for others. When Ethan left the store that day, he didn't know that his actions had created ripples that would spread far and wide. But he understood that planting a seed is enough. The soil will take care of the rest, and that's how change begins. Today's story reminds us that change starts with small actions, from standing up for the truth to opening our hearts to understanding others. Ethan faced prejudice not with anger, but with kindness and courage, planting the seeds for greater change. What do you think about how Ethan handled this situation? What would you have done in a similar circumstance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread positive messages to more people. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next meaningful story.